land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me.
Greetings from Castle Goring from Mickey, Aurora, and from me. Today we will most likely cover only one subject, which will be the unfortunate incident involving Lady Susan Hussey. I am not precipitate. I do not leap in unnecessarily. I was not prepared to rush what I regarded as a very important subject until I knew what I was speaking about and knew the way the land should lie. You know, when things are important, it does not behoove you to leap in. Remember the old adage, fools rush in where wise men fear to tread? Well, life has taught me if it's important, unless you absolutely have to, do not leap in until you know the depth of the pool. So, I will make the rather acerbic comment that had the Prince of Wales's advisors borne that in mind, and had the King's advisors stopped to think of that, they might have had somewhat different responses to the rather unfortunate and, in my view, inadequate and inappropriate responses that they have had to what is essentially a fomented situation. At least that's what my findings tell me, and I'm going with my hunches as well as my findings. I'm reading out one question. There have been so many I can't tell you, but I thought instead of answering questions, because there's ground I want to cover, points I want to make, and the only way to do that is to actually not answer questions which will take me off the points I wish to make and divert me from the path that I wish to tread upon. So, her indoors 3552 says, Lady C, does this all not smack of planned? Ngosi Fulani dressed in what looked like tribal wear, and a lover of all things Meghan, known to spout hate about the monarchy on her website, goes to the palace. Why? It's sickening. Well, the very exotically named Ngosi Fulani is actually in reality the rather more mundanely named Marlene Headley. I think right there you have a clue as to what is happening. Now, I'm going to more or less stick to my narrative today. The first thing is consider the source. Marlene Headley, otherwise known as Ngosi Fulani, is the chief executive of Sister Space, a charity funded by Black Lives Matter that supports women of African and Caribbean heritage who have faced domestic abuse. Well, you could say that's pretty worthy, because I have nothing against charities that are directed at target audiences, so to speak. In the late 80s, Arnold Gordon, who's a wonderful, wonderful black man, founded in my brother's basement of his law offices something called Black Liners, which was an AIDS helpline specifically directed towards the black community, because at the time AIDS was a terrifying prospect, and the black populace in particular had been veering away from the reality of what HIV could result in and how you could get it. And Arnold and my brother decided that it would be a wonderful thing to serve the black community, particularly. So I have nothing against any charity that serves a particular segment of the population, to such an extent that I became its first patron. This, remember, was in the late 80s, and it got official charitable status in October 1991, at a time that people shied away from the subject of AIDS. So nobody can say that Arnold, Mickey, and I did it for personal glory, because we were associating ourselves with something that was really pariah status at the time. I make that point because I think it's important. I have, as I've just said, nothing against Sister Space on the grounds that it services only the African and Caribbean communities. Of course, the anomaly might not have escaped you that there are white Africans as well as white Caribbeans. One is speaking to you at the moment, a white Caribbean. I'm a white Jamaican. Chris Blackwell is a white Jamaican. There are loads of white Jamaicans. There are loads of white Africans. The person who runs weddings here is a white Zimbabwean. I wonder, as I'm speaking, whether Marlene Headley, otherwise known as Ngosi Fulani, would actually embrace those members of the sisterhood. That's a question that occurs to me as I'm speaking. When she is a rabid Meghan supporter, she has denied having ever tweeted about Meghan. Well, after the Oprah interview, when Meghan went on and on about how she had suffered during her pregnancy. Remember the pregnancy where Archie kept on, when she had on that red coat and that lilac dress, Archie at the end of the day dove between her knees when she was pregnant with Archie. Well, when she alleged to Oprah that she was pregnant with Archie and was being subjected to all sorts of racist abuses to the possible colour of Archie's skin, when quite frankly, the royal family would have been delighted had Archie been rather darker than he turned out to be. It would have given them street cred, and they knew it. Remember, they didn't object to the marriage, and certainly not on the grounds of Meghan's colour. So right there, we have a serious anomaly. But anyway, Fulani stroke Headley tweeted after the Oprah interview, "I can't stay silent about this. I admire Meghan for speaking out. According to clear definition, it seems Meghan is a survivor of domestic violence from her in-laws." Now, I mean, that is actually an outrageous comment to make. It is not only outrageous, it is defamatory and clearly indicative of a woman who actually has a racist axe to grind. How did she arrive at that conclusion? Meghan is a survivor of domestic violence from her in-laws. Did anybody beat up Meghan? I mean, you can insult someone verbally. You can be prejudiced and ask questions that are odious. That doesn't make you guilty of domestic violence. I mean, this woman purports to head up a charity that is supposed to be helping women who are survivors of domestic violence, and she doesn't even know what domestic violence is. Well, I'm here to tell her, I'm a survivor of domestic violence. When I was 24 years old, 6 weeks after I was married, Mr. Warner, plastic surgeon at St. George's Hyde Park corner, had to reconstruct the right side of my face. The dental surgeon's name, he was a trainee, if I remember correctly, was Dr. Murdoch. 6 weeks after I was married, my husband smashed up the right side of my face. 6 months after I was married, I was hospitalized at the Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, September, whatever date it was, the beginning of September, the early part of September, 1974, having been severely battered from my neck to my feet over a 6-hour period. That Miss Headley, posing as Ngosi Fulani, is domestic violence. Even if you are the victim of a racist comment, you are not the victim or the survivor of domestic violence. Words have a meaning, and it would be useful if people didn't twist the meaning to suit their narrative, and in so doing distort not only the meaning but the reality. Ngosi Fulani. I wonder what tribe she's a member of. And is she Igbo? Is she Yoruba? What is she? Because, I mean, she's, or with the Bangarangs, as they'd say in Jamaica, and the pseudo-tribal affectations and clothes. But she made sure she wore what she knew to an onlooker would appear to be an African tribal costume to Buckingham Palace. Now, it wasn't a costume party, nor was it a formal event. At formal events, and formal means white tie or at a push black tie, you can have white tie, black tie, stroke tiaras, stroke decorations stroke national dress. National dress is not usually worn to informal events, which is, and the dress code for informal events would be lounge suits for the gentlemen and for the ladies, smart dresses or smart trouser suits. Well, she looked as if she was shipping half of Christmas into Buckingham Palace. She was so overdone. Well, of course, anybody seeing her would immediately think, oh, that's an interesting costume. What tribe is she from? Where is she from? That's the message she was delivering. And that's the message that Susan Hussey got. Now, I'm going to tell you something that you might not know. At the palace and at places like Castle Goring, there are a few questions that you always ask strangers. Have you travelled far? How long did it take you to get here? Oh, where are you from? These are standard questions that are icebreakers. These are standard questions that have been used for generations. Now, how is it that Ngosi Fulani, otherwise known as, or more correctly known as, Marlene Headley, is now in such a splendid position of authority that she is going to decide that a question that I have asked countless people of all different colours and persuasions when they have come to my castle, and I know the Queen, the royals, the ladies in waiting, all the courtiers ask questions like this because they are harmless. How is it all of a sudden it's harmful? But we'll get to that. I think we need to cover the identities of both parties, the main parties in this. Marlene Headley was born in Britain to Bayesian parents. Her parents are from Barbados. She's not African. She is British born of Bayesian parents. She has a black heritage, yes. Why would she be anything but proud of that? And why wouldn't she be forthcoming about it? Especially if she is going to the sartorial equivalent of blackface and dressing up as if she's the tribal chieftain's wife or mistress, when indeed she is nothing but a black Briton of West Indian extraction. She has 3 children, and she started the charity in 2014, if I remember correctly. Her salary is 65,000, and the expenses claimed were, I think, 164,000. I wonder how much was raised and how much was actually spent, because they applied to Hackney Council for certain permissions that were refused them. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate her charity. If she's doing sterling work, good for her. I, in 1981, helped to raise money for the Chiswick Refuge for Battered Wives, which was started by Erin Pitsey, which was the first of the Battered Wives charities. So, good luck to her if it's a genuine charity that genuinely does work and isn't a platform for racist provocation and race baiting. Now we get to Susan Hussey. Susan Hussey was Lady Susan Wardegrave. Her father was the Earl Wardegrave, and her brother, her elder brother, is the present Earl, and her younger brother William is now the Provost of Eton, but William used to be in Mrs. Thatcher's government. I first met William when he came to an event in support of the Palestinians while he was in Mrs. Thatcher's government. If I remember correctly, the Palestinian ambassador, Faisal Aweda, was also there. This would have been in the early 80s. I say all of this because the Wardegraves are a very politically conscious and progressive family. They are well known to be anything but prejudiced, and certainly not colour prejudiced, and certainly not even prejudiced in terms of the Palestinians. I just say that for what it's worth. And she has been a lady in waiting to the Queen for 62 years. Nelson Mandela used to sing her praises and the praises of the other members of the household because they were so civilised, so welcoming, so cooperative. How is it that Nelson Mandela can think that Sue Hussey is a wonderful woman and Marlene Headley posing as Ngosi Fulani thinks she's a racist? But Nelson Mandela didn't. And Nelson Mandela had real dealings with her. And Ngosi Fulani, formerly Marlene Headley, has what I suppose we could call a stitch-up encounter. Also, to show you how totally unprejudiced in every way Lady Susan Hussey is. Her late husband, Marmaduke Hussey, was an amputee. He lost a leg during the war. That didn't stop her from marrying him, having children with him, and living happily with him. Not everybody would be so open-minded as to marry somebody with an infirmity. And that is the reality. And I speak as somebody who was born with a handicap. So I know rather more about handicaps than the average person. So before any of them decide they're going to wade in on me from their vantage point of ignorance and tell me what I'm wrong about and they're right about when I've lived the life and they haven't, save your F. I don't want to hear it. I'm going to tell you something that a member of the black community a very eminent member of the black community, said to me, because I have been taking soundings on this whole matter, because I have to tell you, had Susan Hussey been playing silly buggers and trying it on for size, I would have made sure I sharpened the knife and plunged it right into the remnants of her reputation. But that is not what happened. According to a leading member of the black community who knows Marlene Headley, now posing as Ngosi Fulani, African origin, African attire. Bangarang for days, as they'd say in Jamaica. She was dressed to get noticed and was hoping to provoke a reaction such as she did, knowing that she could spin genuine interest into something else. She is rabidly pro-Meghan. She is anti the royal family. She sees racists evidently behind every white face and any black person who opposes her. She also has form in after black people help her when they're no longer useful to her, in stepping over them as if they are turd on the pavement. And this is from somebody who's black, who's a leading member of the black community, and whom she stepped over. I was told she is a notorious opportunist and an ingrate. And I'm going to quote now. She's got herself in the news, which has always been her ambition and was doubtless her intention. Lucky her. I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't rig herself up in the way she did, hoping to attract Camilla's attention and drag her down. But she had to settle for the lady in waiting instead. Telling comment from somebody who knows the way. Marlene Headley posing as Ngosi Fulani says. And now I'm going to read two comments from two black people, because we need to nail this down as a totally disgusting race baiting that it is, and that black people know as well. I actually tried to get a leading member of the black community who is outraged as to what has happened to speak to me on the record, and they are considering doing it. Whether they will have the courage to do it or not, I don't know. I did warn them, and I'm not going to say whether it's a man or woman, so I'm going to use the grammatically incorrect plural. They are considering it. Nemeso Markey said on Twitter, Lady Susan Hussey did not make racist comments. She simply saw a name she didn't recognize and wanted to know which ethnicity bore the name. Ngosi could have done us proud by saying that she's a proud Igbo descendant, but no. Where you see racism, I see racial inferiority complex. And the well-respected journalist Nana Aqua says, rest assured, Ngosi Fulani's charity Sister Space will only help you if you are of African and Caribbean descent. Sounds like racism to me. I wonder how she finds this out. Presumably she asks, hypocrite. Well, for somebody who resented being asked where she was from, how is it that she's heading up an organization that will only help specific people after she has identified them as to their point of origin? So it is actually hypocritical. Now let's get to the claims of Ngosi Fulani, in reality Marlene Headley. She claimed she felt she was being interrogated as if she had no right to be there. And there I agree with the other commentator that that's most likely her complex speaking. But I don't think it's racial inferiority. I think it's that she knew that for all of the bangarangs and this and that and the endless faux African stuff, she's a West Indian in origin. Nobody says that they are of a nationality from several hundred years ago. And if they do, they're delusional. It's as simple as that. But anyway, this is according to Ngosi Fulani, otherwise known as Marlene Headley. Here is her version of the transcript. Lady S.H. Where are you from? Me, sister space. S.H. No. Where do you come from? Me. We're based in Hackney. No. What part of Africa are you from? Me. I don't know. They didn't leave any records. Now, why does she have on tribal costume if she doesn't know what tribe she's from? I just make that little point for what it's worth. Well, you must know where you're from. I spent time in France. Where are you from? Says Susan Hussey. Me. Here, UK. No, but what nationality are you? Me. I am born here and am British. I mean, talk about playing cat and mouse. If indeed the transcript is accurate, because if it's done from recall, it could be inaccurate. And if it was taped, one has to ask, who tapes a harmless conversation unless they're Amber Heard or Ngosi Fulani, also and otherwise more correctly known as Marlene Headley? Susan Hussey. So let's go back. Me. I am born here and am British. S.H. No. Where do you really come from? Where do your people come from? Me. My people? Lady, what is this? Well, at that point, I will interject because the woman is obviously so unsophisticated that she doesn't know that in polite circles, you say my people as well as my family, and you speak about your people as well as your family. It's a politesse. It's a euphemism. There's nothing harmful in saying my people or your people. It's something that one does all the time. But I suppose she's not sufficiently informed, sophisticated, or indeed proud of her own identity to actually just answer a question, a straight question with a straight answer. Where are you from? I mean, I'm asked, well, I used to be, no longer, because I'm now so well known that everybody knows pretty much where I'm from. But when I was younger and wasn't so well known, because it was obvious I had an accent, people would ask where I was from. Did I ever think anything of it? No. It's perfectly normal. And somebody who's dressed up like she's arrived with half the clothes from a Nigerian store on her back, not to mention the wigs from deepest Africa on her head. Of course you're going to ask where she's from. My people, lady, what is this? Susan Hussey. Oh, I can see I'm going to have a challenge getting you to say where you're from. When did you first come here? Me. Lady, I am a British national. My parents came here in the 50s. When? Susan Hussey. Oh, I knew we'd get there. Oh, and then she ... So presumably she's tailoring the conversation and editing it. Susan Hussey. Oh, I knew we'd get there in the end. You're Caribbean. Me. No, lady. I'm of African heritage, Caribbean descent, and British nationality. Susan Hussey. Oh, so you're from the Caribbean. I mean, it does look as if she set out to entrap somebody. I'm just glad that Camilla didn't ask the question. I'd have asked the question. I don't think I would have been as persevering because I'm not as patient as Susan Hussey. So I would have given up long ago and thought this woman is just a waste of time and space and moved on. And I'd have thought she obviously has a chip on her shoulder. I'm not going to waste my time on her. But Susan Hussey, who's much kinder than I am and much more patient than I am, persevered, trying to elicit information because it was her role to make the woman feel comfortable and appreciated, and that people at the palace were interested in her. And certainly, if you don't have a chip on your shoulder and you're not race baiting, what Susan Hussey was asking was perfectly acceptable and normal. The abnormality came in Lady Fulani's responses. Anyway, Lady Fulani said that following the incident, the rest of the reception was a blur for her. She said, quotes, there was nobody to report it to. Report what? That you behaved like a jerk? Because there was nothing racist in asking you where you were from. Clearly, your ancestors were not from England. Clearly. I mean, it's a no-brainer. When I'm in Jamaica and people don't know who I am and they ask me where we're from, I answer the question. I don't regard it as racism. I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. Anyway, she said there was nobody to report it to. Notice that she's fomenting trouble. I couldn't report it to the Queen Consort. I bet she was hoping that it was Queen Camilla who had actually committed what is being presented as a solecism, but was actually just an act of courtesy and friendliness. Plus, it was such a shock to me and the two other women that we were stunned to temporary silence. Why, aren't you used to people being friendly and asking you questions about yourself? It's usually regarded as civilised to have informative exchanges, especially if you are at the palace in an official capacity for a charity that caters exclusively to African and Caribbean women, and you are dressed like something out of a comic book where African attire is concerned. I just stood at the edge of the room, smiled and engaged briefly with who spoke to me until I could leave. My children and grandchildren were proud, though. In my parents' time, black people were only allowed into those spaces to serve. Kind of glad my folks were not around to witness this violation. Well, this again is racist claptrap. Gandhi was received at the palace. Sir Alexander Bustamante was received at the palace. Loads of black leaders were received at the palace. Queen Victoria had a black foster daughter who was received at the palace. I mean, I'm sorry, this woman's attitudes are unbelievable. But they serve a mischievous racist agenda, born doubtless of prejudice and ignorance. Then she continues, here she is. She must have been speaking to Meghan because they both have great victimhood postures. I let my guard down, never again. It was such a struggle to stay in a space that you were violated in. I think it is essential to acknowledge that trauma has occurred. Trauma. The woman is being traumatized because somebody was asking her where she was really from. In other words, what nationality were her ancestors? And being invited and then insulted has caused much damage. I'm sorry. You talk about reaching for causes of offence where no offence was intended and no offence should have existed. Mandu Reid, leader of the Women's Equality Party, who was standing next to Fulani at the time, said that they were made to feel like gate crashers and described Hussey's line of questioning as racist. How was it racist? Clearly, your ancestors were not of Anglo-Saxon origin. How is that racist? You should be proud of your ancestors. When I'm in Jamaica and people want to know where my ancestors are from, I don't regard it as racist, although it has to be said that my great-grandmother's family were in Jamaica long before any black person. So anyway, she continues. Lady Susan came over and started chatting out of nowhere and zoomed in on Ngosi. Does this woman even know that Ngosi's real name is Marlene? Let me continue. And started asking where she was from. Ngosi said she was from Sister Space, which is the organization she was representing. And Susan said, no, where are you really from? The woman was interested in you, Ngosi Fulani, also known as Marlene Headley. You as the creator of Sister Space. Of course she's going to be interested in you. She knows you're there because you have a valid right to be there. She wants to know your story. And you're saying that asking you for your story is racist? And so are your friends? So anyway, she goes on and on. Because she's repeating pretty much what Ngosi stroke Marlene said. There were three of us there, 3 black women, and we were all taken aback. There were loads of black people there. I mean, the way they're acting, you'd have thought that there's something unusual about black people being at the palace. Well, there isn't. It was like an interrogation, literally, as soon as we had arrived in the first few minutes. This wasn't just a few seconds. It was concerted over several minutes. So it did feel like an interrogation. It felt, as three black women, that we were trespassers, that we were not welcome or accepted as British. Gosh, you women really need somebody to spell it out to you. It doesn't matter whether you were British or not. What mattered was that you were there representing causes, and it was your story, how you came to represent the cause that you were there representing, your point of origin that was of interest, not only in terms of necessarily national identity, but other. But I mean, you'd surely, after Susan Hussey's put through the ringer, you didn't expect her to then say, oh, well, do tell me what charity, etc. I mean, I'm amazed that she didn't bolt sooner. I'd have bolted within the first 10 seconds. Being questioned time and again on what our background is or who we are. I actually thought, is she going to ask me for ID next? Well, she actually wanted to know your story. Why are you acting as if you had something to hide? And you can be sure that she wouldn't have had that line of questioning if Ngosi was a white woman. No chance. You're quite wrong there. You're quite wrong there. The questions are standard and they are asked whether you are black, white, brown, yellow, pink, or green. So you're quite wrong there. But this is, where people who are looking for prejudice find it even when it doesn't exist. We instantly felt like the other in that situation. When we were guests, we were not gate crashers. That's your complexes speaking, my dear. We were guests and we had been invited to celebrate the work we are doing to end violence against women and girls, which is really important. And since you were all there to end violence to women, which is important, surely you could have actually been more forthcoming about your part and therefore your accomplishments. Asking people questions and being interested in them is not racist abuse. It is called civilised conversation. Crikey. We were absolutely incredulous and couldn't understand what it was about or the situation we had been put in. But Lady Susan was really, really persistent in her line of questioning. It was absolutely extraordinary and distressing. Lady Susan just exited the conversation when she was done and went to speak to other people, leaving us all utterly shocked. Well, I've got news for you. The role of a hostess, and she, in her official capacity, was a hostess, is to show interest. She was not to know that you three women would react the way you did, and that you, with your racist awareness, would see racism emanating from somebody that Mandela thought was a lovely person. According to Fulani / Hadley, the exchange lasted 5 or 10 minutes. That's what she said. And then she said what she needed to do was to satisfy herself that I don't qualify as British. And I just thought, wow, well, that is untrue. That is defamatory. Of course, Susan Hussey could sue over that. I'm sure she's not going to, but she could. Nobody was questioning whether you were British or not. She was trying to find out why you as a woman of colour had created this supposedly worthwhile charity that you had created. And a part of the explanation would have been as a result of your identity. Now, she was either going to go about it the way she did, or she was going to say, so did you get beaten up by your husband or your boyfriend? And I suppose that would have satisfied you. I mean, honestly. Then, Ngosi Headley has said she doesn't want Susan Hussey to be targeted. Well, Ngosi Fulani, otherwise known as Marlene Headley, you targeted her deliberately. You're the one who posted the exchange. You're the one who characterized a perfectly ordinary, interesting conversation that should have been, and spun it into something it wasn't, and twisted it into something that it became that it shouldn't have been. You're the one who has created this, as this eminent black person said about you. You most likely did it deliberately. You know, playing the race card is a wicked, wicked thing to do. Meghan does it, and her followers do it. She's using them, and they're using her. And this is just the latest instance of it. I personally think this is going to be a storm in a teacup, because I think the reaction from thinking, sentient, considered black people is already, excuse me, what on earth are you on about? But there has been the ideal victim, Marlene, otherwise known as Ngosi, on television, saying, I let my guard down, never again. It was such a struggle to stay in a space that you were violated in. I think it is essential to acknowledge that trauma has occurred, and being invited and then insulted has caused much damage. You've caused the damage. I mean, I have to tell you, I have had situations in terms of strangers, hundreds, if not thousands of times in my life, where a similar conversation took place in the way it should have taken place with you and Lady Susan, but didn't because of the way you played cat and mouse with her, trying to create mischief where there should have been none. The protocol is to ask people certain questions. If you're dealing with strangers, you don't say, oh, so where did you buy your hair? Or that sort of question you don't ask. But you don't ask if you're heading up a charity for battered women. So, how did you get involved with this? Was it because you were beaten? Or you don't ask questions like that. You ask anodyne questions. And then as the conversation unfolds, depending on the responses, you take it to a more intimate level. Interest is not the same thing as racism. As for the palace's comments, I thought they were wholly inappropriate. A spokesman for Kensington Palace said in a knee-jerk, panicked reaction, and you know, the royal family needs to understand that the issue of racism isn't going away. And there are always going to be racists who will use racism against those who aren't racist. The royal family need to understand that they need to start to deal with this issue in a far more comprehensive and intelligent way than they are doing, because the response from Kensington Palace was actually outrageous. Quotes, I was really disappointed to hear about the guests. This is a spokesman from Kensington Palace said about Prince Wlliam. I was really, because remember, Susan Hussey is his godmother as well. I was really disappointed to hear about the guests' experience at Buckingham Palace last night. Racism has no place in our society. It certainly doesn't, either from host or guest. The comments were unacceptable. Which comments? The comments were unacceptable, and it is right that the individual has stepped aside with immediate effect. That is actually disloyal and outrageous in my view. Susan Hussey has given 62 years of loyal service to the crown and to this country. She deserves better. She deserved at least a response along these lines. It is very upsetting to hear about what has happened at Buckingham Palace last night. Racism has no place in our society. We will be inquiring into this more deeply because it is our understanding that Lady Susan Hussey, who has given 62 years of loyal service to the institution of the monarchy and to the British nation, was revered by Nelson Mandela, and therefore has over the decades had considerable interaction with people of color without there ever having been a problem, and indeed where there was always approbation as to her conduct and her attitude. And therefore we need to inquire deeply, more deeply, to find out what took place, because it is our initial suspicion that there has been a misunderstanding, and we would hope to clear it up to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. That was the morally correct thing to do. That was the principled thing to do. That was the noble thing to do. Trying to say that somebody without an investigation should have a 62-year career end ignominiously because of the accusations of a woman who, it turns out, is a Meghan supporter and has most likely fomented something out of nothing. I'm afraid better is not only expected from Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, which it has to be said was much gentler, but it is demanded. It is necessary. William, if you're gonna accede to a throne, eventually, you need to use this incident as an awful warning of the pitfalls into which you will fall if you take precipitate action and allow the fear of being accused of something that you are not, to actually cause more harm than a more measured response would cause. There is no point in us having a monarchy if loyalty is disregarded, and if the crown is so terrified of being accused of racism, even when it knows somebody isn't a racist, that they're going to throw them under the bus and palliate people who actually hate you and sacrifice people who love you and have served you, and you're going to throw them under the bus to palliate people who want to bring you down? This is insanity. I mean, okay, you're young and you will learn. Let's hope it's not having made more mistakes like this, because you will most likely learn it in exile as a dethroned royal. Because I promise you, there is no way the monarchies can survive without the respect of its supporters. I think on that note, I ought to end and say thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been of some interest to you. If it has, please like, share, subscribe, press the notification bell, and please keep the questions and comments coming in. And may I say, please feel free to ask me specific questions on this subject, because this, I think, is something that might bubble along, and I'm happy to answer them, because I know what racism is. And racism is very, very deadly. Don't take my word for it. Ask my grandfather. Ask my brother-in-law. Ask my first cousin Maurice. Ask my second cousin Aby Baby. And that's just 4 of them. Racism is deadly. And we need to make sure that the racists don't get the upper hand. And believe me, they will. If we do not confront racism of all kinds from all quarters with the staunchness and the integrity and the resolution that we need to possess to do so successfully, we will be mowed down by the racists. This is their objective, and they will succeed. And I leave you with the thought that if they want reparations, I just leave you with this one thought. If they want reparations, since the British state only finished paying off its debt to buy the slaves out freedom, it took 200 years, nearly, to pay off the national debt. Is Ngosi Fulani, as a Briton, going to regard that her tax money should go to pay people in the West Indies? I ask that question for what it's worth, so that maybe greater wisdom and reason will prevail than the rhetoric that exists at the moment. Because we as a country can't even afford what we need to spend right now for ourselves without paying reparations. And who's going to pay the reparations? The British people, including Ngosi Fulani, or are black people going to be exempt? You see how layered and complex, and quite frankly ludicrous, much of the rhetoric and the objectives of the racists really, if you examine it, will turn out to be. I think I've said enough. Thank you so much for listening. God bless and goodbye.